Eleanor Whitmore had been invisible for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to be seen. So when the most respected rancher in the Kansas Territory walked through the kitchen door and looked directly at her, not through her, not past her, but at her, her hands went still on the coffee pot, and her breath stopped somewhere between her chest and her throat. Behind her, she heard her mother's voice cut through the kitchen like a blade. "Eleanor, go back to the stove. You are not who he came for." If this story already has your heart, subscribe to this channel and follow every part until the very end. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's begin. Kansas Territory, 1881. The Whitmore house had been scrubbed from floorboard to ceiling beam for 3 days straight, and Eleanor had done most of the scrubbing herself. She had boiled the curtains, polished the silver. Her mother only brought out for company, beaten the rugs until her shoulders ached, and spent the better part of Tuesday afternoon on her hands and knees pressing the parlor floor with a brush her grandmother had left behind. She had done all of it quietly, without complaint, without being asked twice, and without once being thanked. That was how it had always worked in the Whitmore house. Charlotte and Amelia were the daughters you showed to the world. Eleanor was the one who made the world presentable enough to show them in. Charlotte was the oldest, 29 tall, with dark hair she arranged each morning with the kind of patience Eleanor had never been able to afford, because someone had to be starting breakfast while Charlotte was still at the mirror. She had a way of entering a room that made people feel she had been expected. Her laugh was practiced, and her opinions were always delivered with enough sweetness that nobody ever realized they had been talked over until after she had already left. Amelia was the youngest, 22, still carrying the softness of a girl who had never been asked to carry much of anything else. She was genuine in a way Charlotte was not, but she was also accustomed to having her needs come first, by virtue of being the baby, and that had settled into her personality like a habit so old it no longer felt like one. When Amelia cried, people moved to comfort her. When Eleanor had cried as a child, she had mostly been told to finish what she was doing first. Eleanor was 26, and she occupied the space between her sisters the way a comma occupies the space between two important words, necessary for the whole thing to make sense, but not the part anyone reads twice. She was a plus-size woman with a soft round face and hands that had been roughened by work before she was 15. She had her grandmother's eyes wide-set gray-green, the kind that noticed things, and a mouth her mother had told her too many times to keep closed in company. She was not plain, but the world had decided she was, and Eleanor had long since stopped arguing with the world about it, because the world had more endurance for that argument than she did. William Carter was coming on Friday. The entire county knew who William Carter was. You did not live in Willow Creek, or anywhere within 30 miles of it, without knowing the name. He had built the Carter Ranch from nothing but 40 acres of rocky land, and a stubbornness that men in the county saloons had been arguing about for 2 decades, whether it was admirable or simply inconvenient, depending on whether you were doing business with him or against him. He had lost his wife May 4 years ago to a fever that took her in less than a week. No children. No family left nearby. Just the ranch and the work and the empty rooms he had apparently run out of reasons to fill with furniture. How was 38 solvent in a way that made other men quiet when his finances came up in conversation, and he was, according to Dorothea Whitmore, exactly the kind of man her daughters deserved, specifically Charlotte and Amelia. "He will arrive at 3, Dorothea announced at breakfast on Friday morning, not looking up from the letter she had read so many times. The fold lines had gone soft. "Charlotte, I want you in the blue dress. Amelia, wear your mother-of-pearl brooch and pin your hair up. You look older with it up. Eleanor." She paused. Eleanor looked up from the stove. "Make sure the coffee is hot and the bread is fresh, and stay in the kitchen unless I call for you." "Yes, ma'am," Eleanor said. That was all. No instruction about what to wear. No mention of her being introduced. No suggestion that William Carter, when he arrived with his good coat and his serious eyes and his solvent bank account, might be interested in meeting all 3 daughters, because her mother was not expecting that to be necessary. Her father, Harold Whitmore, was a man who had once had ambitions that slowly contracted over the years until they fit neatly inside a glass of whiskey at the end of each evening. He was not cruel. Eleanor had known cruel, and her father was not that. He was simply a man who had arranged his family the way you arrange furniture, the good pieces in the front room where company could see them, and the functional pieces in the back where they would not interrupt the view. He had assigned Eleanor to the kitchen years ago, not out of malice, but out of a quiet certainty that this was where she would cause the least disruption. She had never challenged him on it. She should have. Charlotte swept into the kitchen at 2:30 to inspect the coffee pot and find it lacking. "It smells burned," she announced. "It isn't burned," Eleanor said. "It smells burned to me." "Then you may make a fresh pot if you feel strongly about it." Charlotte set her jaw the way she did when she wanted to say something sharp, but was conserving her sharpness for an audience worth spending it on. "Don't embarrass us today, Eleanor. I'll be in the kitchen the whole time," Eleanor said. "It would be difficult to embarrass anyone from the kitchen." Charlotte left without answering. Amelia came in 5 minutes later, nervous in a way she was trying to hide by fidgeting with her brooch. "Do I look all right?" Eleanor looked at her. "You look lovely." "Charlotte says he has never remarried because he is too particular." "That may be true." "What if he doesn't like either of us? Then he will say so politely and ride home," Eleanor said. "And nothing in your life will change except that you'll have had a nice afternoon." Amelia stared at her. "How are you so calm about all of this?" "Because none of it concerns me," Eleanor said. She said it plainly without bitterness, because she had made peace with that particular truth somewhere around age 19. And she found that things you had already grieved did not make you cry anymore. They just sat in you quiet and settled like stones at the bottom of a cold creek. Amelia left. Eleanor set out the bread, poured the coffee, arranged everything with the kind of efficiency that comes from doing a thing. So many times, your hands know the shape of it without your mind having to engage. She pressed her palms flat on the kitchen table and looked at the spread. Everything was exactly right. No one would say so. William Carter arrived at 3 o'clock with his foreman, a lean, quiet man named Jonas Briggs, who waited outside with the horses while William came in. He had the kind of presence that Eleanor, from her position in the kitchen doorway, recognized immediately. Not loud, not performing, but solid. The kind of man who came into a room and the room just rearranged itself slightly around him without anyone noticing it had happened. She heard her mother laugh, the particular laugh Dorothea reserved for men with money, and Charlotte's voice warm and deliberate saying something Eleanor couldn't quite make out, but didn't need to. She heard Amelia say, "It is such a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Carter," with that slight breathiness she used when she was trying to sound like less than she was, because she had been taught that men preferred women who seemed like slightly less. Eleanor put the bread on the good plate and carried the coffee service into the parlor. She kept her eyes on the tray. She set things down carefully, the pot on its stand. The cups arranged the breadbasket to the left, the way her mother liked, and she was already turning to go back when her mother said with the brightness of someone managing a stage, "And this is our Eleanor. She helps with the household. Not our third daughter. Not Eleanor, who has been running this house since she was 14, helps with the household, like she was a neighbor who came by on Tuesdays." Eleanor turned and looked at William Carter for the first time. He was looking directly at her. Not the way men sometimes looked at her, cataloging her size, finding her unremarkable, moving on. He was looking at her the way you look at something that has caught you off guard, and you are still working out why. She nodded. "Mr. Carter." "Miss Whitmore," he said. She went back to the kitchen. She was refilling the breadbasket when she heard the conversation in the parlor shift to water. It happened because her father, 3 glasses into a hospitality that had made him expansive, started talking about the drought and Richard Caldwell and the water rights dispute that had been grinding through the county for 2 years. Harold said what he always said, that Caldwell was within his rights, that the water came from the Caldwell property, that the smaller ranches would simply have to negotiate or relocate. That was the nature of progress. Charlotte nodded because she had learned to agree with whoever seemed most confident. Amelia said, "It does seem very complicated," which was her way of participating without committing to anything. William listened. And then Harold said, with the authority of a man who had never personally been required to understand a thing before having an opinion about it. "The Caldwell stream feeds from the North Hills. He owns the North Hills. There's no argument to be made. Eleanor was standing in the doorway with the bread basket in her hands. She did not mean to speak. The words came out of her the way truth sometimes does, not from a decision, but from an inability to stay quiet in the presence of something wrong. "That isn't where the water comes from," she said. The parlor went still. Her mother's expression was the one Eleanor knew, the way she knew the creaks in the floorboards. The specific tight-lipped stillness that meant she had stepped wrong and would hear about it later. Harold said slowly, "Eleanor, the primary source is the Lower Valley Spring," she said. "It's been there since before the Caldwell family arrived. My grandfather mapped it. The stream on the North Hill is fed by the Valley Spring, not the other way around." If anyone had looked at the actual survey maps from 1847, instead of repeating what Caldwell's lawyer wrote in a county circular, they would know that. Charlotte let out a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh, designed to communicate to William Carter that her sister was an embarrassment, but an understandable one. "Eleanor tends to have opinions about everything," she said lightly. "She tends to read," Amelia said, which was not intended as a defense, but functioned as one. Harold said louder, "That's enough." Eleanor looked at him. Then she looked at the table. She set the bread down, turned and went back into the kitchen, because that was what you did when you had said your piece to a room that didn't want it. She stood at the sink and pressed her hands against the basin and breathed. Behind her, she heard the conversation in the parlor restart, everyone pulling away from the moment like water flowing back around a stone. She did not hear what William Carter said. She was busy telling herself it did not matter. She was wrong about that. She had been wrong about a great number of things when it came to what mattered, because she had spent so many years deciding in advance that she didn't, and that prior decision had a way of coloring everything else. 20 minutes later, she heard her father say, "Mr. Carter, perhaps you'd like to continue your conversation with Charlotte in the garden. The evening light is—" "Actually," said William Carter, "I'd like a word with Miss Eleanor if she's agreeable." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Eleanor had heard in years. She stood very still in the kitchen, one hand still resting on the basin, and waited to hear if she had imagined it. She had not. Her mother's voice came careful and controlled. "Of course, Eleanor." A pause. "Eleanor, Mr. Carter would like to speak with you." Eleanor dried her hands. She folded the cloth. She walked into the doorway of the parlor, and William Carter was already standing, and he looked at her with an expression she had no practice reading on a man's face, because no man had ever directed it at her before. Serious attention. Not polite attention. Not the attention that people perform when they're waiting for their turn to speak. Actual focused, careful attention, like what she was, and what she might say next, was a thing worth being still for. "Would you walk with me?" he said. She stopped. "I need to clear the—" "It can wait," her mother said from somewhere Eleanor wasn't looking. She looked at William Carter. He was waiting. "All right," she said. They walked out through the front door, past Jonas Briggs and the horses, out to where the light had started going. Gold at the edges, the way Kansas evenings did. In late summer slowly, then all at once, like the sun couldn't make up its mind about leaving. They walked to the edge of the property, where the fence line met the road, and they stood there a moment without talking. William spoke first. "What your grandfather mapped," he said. "Do you have those surveys?" She turned to look at him. She had expected something else. She did not know what exactly. Something social. Something manageable. Not this. "Yes," she said. "He left them to me. My father doesn't know I kept them. He thought they were burned in the fire of 1874 with the rest of the land records." "Were they?" "No. I put them in a tin box and buried the tin box in the barn when I was 13 years old because I had already read them twice, and I knew they mattered, and I knew they would be lost if I didn't do something about them." He looked at her steadily. "You were 13. I read fast." Something shifted in his face. Then, not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one, the kind that lives around the corners of a man's mouth before he decides whether to let it out. "Why didn't you say something sooner about the water?" "I have," Eleanor said. "Many times, over several years, to various people." She paused. "No one listens to the woman in the kitchen." He was quiet for a moment. I heard you, he said. She looked at him. I want you to know that, he said. Not as a courtesy, as a fact. I heard you, and I know enough about the land and the surveys in this county to know you're right. The North Hill Stream argument is Caldwell's lawyer's invention. I've been trying to find someone who could prove it for 14 months. Eleanor's heart was doing something she did not have a word for. It was not quite hope, because hope was a thing you tended carefully in private, and this was too sudden and too exposed to be that. It was something rawer than hope. It was the feeling of a door opening in a room you had stopped believing had a door. What would you need? She said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. To prove it. The surveys. A witness who understands the land. Someone willing to stand in front of a room full of people who have already decided against her and say what's true anyway. He paused. Are you that person? She thought about standing in the parlor doorway with the bread basket. She thought about her father's voice saying, "That's enough." She thought about every room she had walked out of. I don't know yet, she said honestly. He nodded like that was the right answer. Fair enough. They stood at the fence for another minute, and then he said, Miss Whitmore, I came here today because a matchmaker told me the Whitmore family had daughters worth meeting. They do, Eleanor said. Yes, he said. They do. He looked at her directly. I came here to meet your sisters, but I'd like your permission to call again. On you. The words arrived, and Eleanor's mind did what it always did when something threatened to matter. It tried to find the catch. Mr. Carter, she said, I want to be plain with you, because I've found that being otherwise costs more than I can afford. I am not what people would call an advantageous match. I have no connections that would benefit a man in your position. I have no particular beauty that anyone has ever bothered to remark upon. My family will tell you I am useful, and they mean it kindly, but useful is not the same as desirable. I am aware of what I am and what I am not, and I would rather you understand that now before. Miss Whitmore, he said quietly. She stopped. I have spent, he said, choosing his words the way a man chooses his footing on uncertain ground, carefully, deliberately, without rushing. A very long time around people who are advantageous, who are connections, who are unremarkable in the ways the world considers remarkable. He paused. I am 38 years old, and I lost a woman I loved to 4 days of fever, and I have been sitting alone in a very large house for 4 years, watching men tell other men what the land is doing without once actually looking at the land. Another pause. I did not come here looking for someone with the right connections, ma'am. I came because I am tired of being in a room where no one says the true thing. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. The true thing, she said, is often unwelcome. I know, he said. I'm asking you anyway. She let out a breath, slow, quiet. You may call again, she said. If you'd like. I'd like, he said. The walk back to the house was short. Her mother met them at the door with an expression that had gone very still in the particular way that meant she was deciding how to feel about something before she allowed herself to feel it. Charlotte was standing behind her with her arms crossed and a smile that didn't reach the parts of her face above her cheekbones. Amelia looked genuinely confused, which was the most honest response in the room. Her father stood at the edge of the parlor and said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. William Carter thanked the Whitmore family for their hospitality, collected Jonas Briggs from outside, and rode back in the direction of his ranch. The door had barely closed before Charlotte said, What on earth did he want to talk to you about? The water survey, Eleanor said. The water survey. Charlotte repeated like those words in that order were incomprehensible. Yes, he came here to find a wife, her mother said in the flat tone of a woman recalibrating. I'm aware of that, Eleanor said, and he spent his time talking to you about a water survey. And other things, Eleanor said. He asked to call again. The room changed. She watched it change. She watched her mother's expression reorganize itself around a new set of calculations. She watched Charlotte's smile go from practiced to sharp. She watched Amelia's confusion deepen into something more complicated, because Amelia was genuinely sweet-natured enough that she did not quite know how to feel about her sister, receiving something that had not been intended for her. And she was young enough that she had not yet learned how to be gracious about that in front of people. Her father said from the parlor doorway, "Eleanor, is that true?" "Yes, sir." Harold Whitmore looked at her for a long moment. She could not read his expression. She had never been entirely able to read her father's expression when it concerned her because he did not look at her often enough for her to have learned its vocabulary. "Well," he said finally. And then he walked back into the parlor and picked up his glass. That was all. Not congratulations. Not surprise. Not pride, and not displeasure. Just well and the sound of his footsteps retreating. Eleanor went back to the kitchen. She gathered the cups. She washed the coffee pot. She put away the good bread plate and the silver her mother only brought out for company. She did all of it with her hands moving through the familiar motions, and her mind somewhere out along the fence line, standing in the gold-edged evening light, with a man who had looked at her like she was a thing worth being still for. She did not let herself think too far ahead. She had learned the hard way, and more than once, that the distance between a moment and the meaning of a moment was longer than it looked, and that crossing it too quickly was how you ended up standing in open ground with nothing to hold on to. But she let herself think he heard me. Just that. Small enough to hold. True enough to keep. He heard me. William Carter called 3 days later. He did not bring flowers, which Eleanor respected, because flowers were what you brought to a woman you were trying to impress, and she had the impression that impressing her was not what he was trying to do. He came with 2 cups of coffee from the trading post in town, his own, and one for her, and he sat across from her at the kitchen table, while her mother hovered in the doorway long enough to establish that she was aware of the situation, and then retreated, because even Dorothea Whitmore understood that some conversations required the pretense of privacy. He asked about the surveys. She brought out the tin box from where she had moved it since childhood under the loose board behind the pantry shelf, and spread the maps across the table between them, and they talked about water tables and survey methods and the particular shape of the valley for 2 hours. And Eleanor's hands moved across the old paper like she was reading a language she had always known, but had never had anyone to speak it with. He asked good questions. She had forgotten, or perhaps had never fully known what it felt like when someone asked good questions. Not the questions that were actually statements with question marks appended. Not the questions designed to make her feel she was being consulted while actually steering her toward someone else's conclusion. Questions that were genuinely questions that hung in the air waiting for her answer, because her answer was the point. "This line here," he said, pressing a finger to a notation in her grandfather's handwriting. "Your grandfather marked this as seasonal. Does it run year-round now?" "It does since 1869, she said. "There was a geological shift, small earthquake. No one's recorded it properly, but the ground moved enough to reroute the water table. The spring went from seasonal to permanent. Caldwell's claim is based on the 1861 survey. The 1861 survey is obsolete." He sat back, looked at her. "How do you know about the earthquake?" "My grandfather wrote about it. He also talked about it. I listened." She paused. "I was very good at listening when I was young. It was the primary thing I could do that no one thought to stop me from doing." Something in his face shifted, something quiet and careful, like he was turning a thought over before deciding what to do with it. "Who stopped you from doing other things?" "No one specifically," she said. "The world generally. It has a way of not requiring much active stopping once a person has accepted what is expected of her." "Have you," he said, "accepted it?" She thought about it honestly. "Most of it," she said. "Some of it I've been revisiting recently." He looked at the surveys. He looked at her. He said slowly, "There is going to be a county water meeting in 6 weeks. Caldwell is going to present his claim to the full council. If someone could present a counterclaim with evidence with these surveys, with a witness who understands what they're reading, it would change the outcome." "I know," she said. "Would you do it?" She looked down at her grandfather's handwriting. The loops of his letters, the precision of his notations, the way he had taken time and care over something no one else had bothered to look at. He had left these to her specifically. Not to Harold. Not to a son. To Eleanor because she was the one who had sat beside him at his maps, and she was the one who had asked the questions that made him understand she saw what he saw. "I don't know if I'm brave enough," she said. "I think you might be wrong about that," he said. "You've known me for 3 days. I know what you did in that parlor," he said. "With a room full of people ready to dismiss you before you opened your mouth, and a father who told you to be quiet, and 2 sisters who were performing for an audience you were supposed to be invisible in front of. You said the true thing. You didn't shout it. You didn't perform it. You just said it because it was true." He paused. "That takes more than most people have." Eleanor pressed her palms flat on the table. The old familiar gesture. The one that meant she was steadying herself. "William." She said his name the first time she had used it, which meant something, and they both felt it land. "I want to tell you something." "All right," he said. "I am a practical woman," she said. "I have been practical because I did not have the luxury of being otherwise, and that has served me adequately, and I intend to remain practical, even in circumstances that might tempt a less sensible person toward sentiment." She met his eyes. "So when I say that I am deeply uncertain what to make of you, and that I am proceeding with significant caution, please understand that is not dismissal. It is the most hopeful thing I know how to say out loud." Howe was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's the most honest thing anyone has said to me in 4 years." "Good," she said. "I'll take it," he said. She let herself very quietly, very carefully smile. He called again the following week. And the week after that. He never came with flowers. He came with questions, and time, and a steadiness that did not demand anything from her, but honesty in return. And Eleanor, who had spent 26 years arranging herself to be useful and undemanding and invisible, discovered in those weeks something she had not known: she was missing the experience of being anticipated. He anticipated her. Not her usefulness, what she would think about a thing, what she would say about a problem, whether she would laugh at something or look at him with that expression. She had the one that told him he had said something she found more interesting than funny. High made her feel, and this was the part she turned over in her mind at night, with the same careful attention she gave to the surveys, examining it for cracks. Like the most important thing in a room she was standing in. Not the most beautiful. Not the most accomplished. Not the most socially advantageous. The most important. She did not know what to do with that. She was still learning. 6 weeks moved faster than she expected. And then it was 4 days before the county water meeting, and William Carter arrived at the Whitmore house on a Tuesday morning with a look on his face that was professional and direct, and told Eleanor before he said a word that something had shifted. "Caldwell knows," he said when they were alone in the kitchen with the door half shut. She set down the cloth she was holding. "Knows what?" "That someone has evidence against his claim. He doesn't know it's you, not yet, but he has people asking questions, and it won't take long before someone figures out that you're the only person in this county with access to the original surveys." He paused. "I need you to know that this has become more than a land dispute. He has money, and he has influence, and he is not a man who accepts losing." "I know who Richard Caldwell is," Eleanor said. "Then you know what he's capable of." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "What does that mean for the meeting?" "It means you will walk into that room with the full weight of his opposition against you, and not everyone who should be your ally will be willing to show up as one when it costs them something." William's voice was even not dramatic. He was telling her the truth, the way you tell someone the truth when you respect them enough not to soften it past usefulness. "It means the people who have spent years ignoring you will be very motivated to continue ignoring you. And it means the people who have never taken you seriously will be counting on you to demonstrate that they were right not to." Eleanor was quiet. "It also means," he said, and his voice changed just slightly, just enough, "that I will be standing right beside you, for whatever that's worth." She looked at him. "For whatever that's worth." He said it like he understood she might have reasons not to trust the offer. Like he understood that a woman who had spent her whole life being told to stay in the kitchen might need more than a man's word before she believed his presence beside her was a real thing and not a performance. He was right. She needed more than a word. But the word coming from him in that voice was a beginning. "I'll be there," she said. "At the meeting." "I know you will," he said. "I never doubted it." "I doubted it," she said honestly, "about 15 minutes ago. And now," she thought about her grandfather's maps. She thought about the surveys in the tin box. She thought about every room she had walked out of, and every truth she had swallowed, and every time she had made herself smaller to fit into the space the world had allotted her, and called it peace. "Now," she said, "I'm just angry enough to do something about it." William Carter looked at her, the way he had looked at her that first evening, like she was a thing worth being still for. And this time, he let the smile all the way through. "There she is," he said quietly, like he had been waiting for her to arrive, like he had known before she did that she was on her way. The anger lasted Eleanor exactly 48 hours. Then the fear came back. It came the way. Fear always came for her. Not all at once, not in a rush, but slowly. The way water rises in a low room, quietly, steadily, until you look down and realize it has already reached your ankles and you were too busy with other things to notice. She woke on Thursday morning 2 days after she had told William she was angry enough to do something, and the anger was still there, but the fear had settled around it like silt around a stone, and she lay in the dark for a long time, thinking about Richard Caldwell and the county council and the particular silence of a room full of people who have already decided not to hear you. She got up, made the coffee, started the bread. Her hands moved through the motions, and her mind stayed in that meeting room. She hadn't entered yet, running the conversation, rehearsing the words, feeling the weight of every eye in Willow Creek turning toward her with expressions that ranged from amused to hostile. And she kept arriving at the same moment, the moment when she would have to open her mouth and say the true thing in front of people who had already decided it wasn't true. And her lungs would do something tight and insufficient, and she would have to set down whatever she was holding and breathe through it. She was doing that, setting down the bread knife, pressing her hands flat on the table, breathing when Charlotte came into the kitchen. Charlotte looked at her hands on the table, at her face. She poured herself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter in the way she had when she was thinking about something she wanted to say and was deciding how to frame it for maximum effect. "He came back again yesterday," Charlotte said. "I know," Eleanor said. "I was here. I noticed." Eleanor picked up the bread knife again. "He doesn't look at us, you know," Charlotte said. "When he comes, Amelia and me, he is perfectly polite. He says the right things, but he doesn't—" She paused. "He looks for you, even when you're not in the room. I can tell when a man is looking for someone." Eleanor did not answer. "I want to understand it," Charlotte said, and her voice had shifted, still careful, still controlled, but underneath it, something that might in another woman with less practice at managing herself have been something raw. "Not because I'm angry. I'm trying to understand it genuinely. What does he see?" Eleanor looked at her sister. Charlotte was beautiful, had always been beautiful. And she was asking this question with an earnestness that Eleanor did not know how to hold because she had not expected it and had no prepared defense against it. "I don't know," Eleanor said honestly. "I keep waiting to find out he's made a mistake." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. Then she said very quietly, "Maybe that's it." "What is that you don't know?" She wrapped both hands around her cup. "I always know. When a man looks at me, I always know exactly what he's seeing. And I know how to keep showing him that thing until he stops looking." She paused. "You have no idea what he sees, so you're just being yourself, and he keeps coming back anyway." Eleanor stood with the bread knife in her hand and looked at her sister, and for a moment the years of kitchens and coffee pots and stay in the background. Eleanor fell away, and they were just two women standing in a room being honest with each other, which happened between them, so rarely that Eleanor could count the times on one hand and still have fingers left over. "Charlotte," she said. "Don't," Charlotte said, and the control came back smooth and practiced, closing over whatever had been there. She set down her cup. "Don't be kind about it. I can't manage kindness from you right now. Just don't embarrass us at that water meeting." She left. Eleanor stood in the kitchen for a long moment. Then she went back to the bread. The day before the meeting, her father called her into the parlor. Howe was seated in his chair, The good one by the window, the one nobody else sat in, and he had not poured his evening glass yet, which meant he was sober enough to be deliberate, and that was either better or worse than the alternative, depending on what he had to say. "Close the door," he said. She closed it. "Sit down." She sat in the chair across from him and waited. Harold Whitmore looked at his daughter the way he always had, like he was trying to find in her face something he'd expected to be there and had never quite located. "Richard Caldwell came in to see me this afternoon," he said. Eleanor's hands went still in her lap. "How was very cordial," her father said. "He is always cordial, Richard. It's one of the things about him that makes him difficult." He turned his glass empty on the side table slowly with 2 fingers. "He said he'd heard there was someone in the county with survey documents that might be introduced at the meeting tomorrow. Old surveys, belonging to a private family." He looked at her. "He did not name you specifically." "But he knows," Eleanor said. "He knows." She held his gaze. "What did you tell him?" Harold was quiet for a long moment. A long moment that had things in it. Years of things. A whole history of decisions made and not made of a man who had put his useful daughter in the kitchen and told himself it was the right arrangement, and had been telling himself that for so long that stopping now felt like an admission. "I told him," her father said slowly, "that I was not aware of any surveys in my family's possession." Eleanor stared at him. "Which is technically true," he said, "since they were in your possession and you are not technically my family's possession." She did not know what to say. Harold picked up his empty glass, looked at it, set it back down. "Eleanor, I am going to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." "Yes, sir." "Are you certain about the surveys, about what they say?" "Yes." "Not maybe certain, not probably certain." "Certain," she said. "Grandfather mapped the spring himself. The survey dates are documented. The geological record supports the shift. I have read everything available on this subject for the better part of 10 years, and I am certain." Harold looked at her for a long time. "All right," he said. "All right," she repeated. "All right." He picked up his glass again. This time he held it, just held it like he needed something in his hands to say the next thing. "Your grandfather was a careful man. He did not make mistakes about land." A pause. "And you are your grandfather's granddaughter, whatever else you are or are not." Eleanor sat very still. "I will not be at the meeting," her father said. "I cannot afford to be seen there against Caldwell. I have obligations to certain people, and I cannot cross them publicly." He did not look at her when he said it, and she understood he was telling her his limitation, not asking her forgiveness for it. "But I am not going to stand in your way. I want you to know that. Whatever I said to Caldwell this afternoon, that was not a promise. It was a deflection. There is a difference." "There is," Eleanor said carefully. "You will do what you believe is right," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, sir." He nodded, looked at the window, said with the particular quietness of a man who has more to account for than he knows how to say, "Your grandfather would have been proud of you." Eleanor stood up. Her legs were steadier than they had any right to be. "Good night, Father," she said. She did not know if he answered. She was already at the door. William came to the house that evening, which was outside their usual arrangement, and Eleanor met him on the porch, because she did not trust the interior of the house to contain this conversation without too many ears in it. "Caldwell's been to see my foreman," he said without preamble. "Offered Jonas a sum of money to misplace certain documents. Jonas told him no, and told me within the hour." He looked at her. "He is moving faster than I expected." "He came to see my father," Eleanor said. William's jaw tightened. "What did your father say?" "He deflected. Didn't promise him anything." She paused. "He told me my grandfather would have been proud." Something moved across William's face. Quick private, the kind of expression that happens between one feeling and the next. "He's right. Don't," Eleanor said, and she heard Charlotte's voice in her own, the same controlled refusal of a kindness that was too much to absorb at the wrong moment. "Not right now. Tell me what I need to know about tomorrow." He studied her for a moment, then accepted her terms. "Caldwell will speak first. He has the council's schedule arranged in his favor, that's money talking, and there's no changing it tonight. His lawyer will present the 1861 survey and the claim documentation. They're polished. They've done this before. He paused. You will speak second if you speak at all. They may not let you speak. There are men on that council who have reasons to see Caldwell's claims succeed, and they will use procedural arguments to shut you down if they can. What reasons? Debts, agreements. The usual architecture of a man who has been buying influence for 30 years. His voice was flat, matter-of-fact. You need to be prepared to be interrupted, to be dismissed, to be told your documentation is insufficient or improperly dated or otherwise inadmissible. And you need to be prepared to hold your ground through all of that without losing your composure, because the moment you show anger or upset, they will use that as the reason not to listen. Eleanor stood very still. You're describing a situation designed for me to fail. I'm describing the situation as it actually is, he said. So you can walk into it knowing exactly what you're facing instead of being surprised by it. She looked at him. That's the most honest thing anyone has said to me this week. You deserve honest. I know, she said. It's still surprising. I was quiet for a moment, and then he said something she had not expected. I need to tell you something about why this matters to me, beyond the water rights, beyond the council. He stopped and started again more carefully. My wife May, she knew things too, about people, about situations. She had a way of reading what was actually happening underneath what everyone said was happening. And I spent most of our marriage telling her she was right after it was too late for it to do any good. His voice stayed level, but it had weight in it now, real weight, the kind that comes from things you cannot undo. I am not going to make that mistake again with a person who has something true to say. Eleanor did not breathe for a moment. Then she said very quietly, William? I know, he said. I know what I just said. I mean it. This is... She stopped, started again. This is a very large thing to put in front of me the night before a county water meeting. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. You're right, bad timing. Terrible timing. I'm still glad I said it. She looked at him in the low evening light. This man who had walked into her family's parlor, looking for a wife, and had somehow ended up here on her porch the night before she was going to stand in front of a room full of hostile strangers and say the true thing, telling her she deserved honest and meaning it all the way through. I'll see you tomorrow, she said. I'll be there before the council convenes, he said. Save me a seat. The seats are public. Save me one anyway. She went inside. She did not sleep much. She spent the better part of the night sitting at the kitchen table with her grandfather's maps spread in front of her. Not reviewing them. She knew them by heart, just touching the paper, tracing the lines with the tips of her fingers, like she was trying to absorb whatever steadiness her grandfather had put into the making of them. He had been a precise man, a careful man. He had taken time over things that mattered, and he had taught Eleanor without ever saying it directly, that the things worth knowing were worth knowing completely, and that being right when everyone around you was wrong was not a triumph so much as a responsibility. She thought about responsibility, about what it meant to carry knowledge that could change things and choose to keep it buried in a tin box under a barn floor because the people around you had trained you to believe that your knowledge didn't count. She had buried those surveys at 13 to save them. She had kept them hidden for 13 years to protect them. Tomorrow she was going to take them out in front of the whole county and read them out loud. She folded them carefully, returned them to the tin box, and went to get 2 hours of sleep before the sun came up. The county meeting hall was already half full when Eleanor arrived with the tin box under her arm and her good dress on, not the dress her mother had suggested, which was beige and inoffensive, but the dark blue one her grandmother had left her, the one that fit properly and did not apologize for the woman inside it. She felt eyes track her as she came through the door. She had expected that. She had prepared for that. She walked to a seat 3 rows from the front with her head level and her tin box held against her body like an argument she was waiting to make, and she sat down, and she set the box on her lap, and she looked at the front of the room. Richard Caldwell was already there. She had seen him before in the general store, at the post office, at the edge of situations she was usually too far in the background to be part of. He was a large man in the physical sense, and a larger man in the civic sense, and he stood at the front of the room talking to two members of the county council with the relaxed confidence of someone who has already calculated the outcome and found it satisfactory. He did not look at Eleanor, but his lawyer did. His lawyer, a man from Wichita whose name Eleanor did not know, but whose type she recognized, looked at Eleanor and her tin box with the specific expression of a man who had been told to expect an obstacle and was now calculating how big an obstacle it actually was. He said something to Caldwell. Caldwell glanced over. He looked at her for 2 seconds, no more. Then he went back to his conversation. He dismissed her in 2 seconds, looked at the plus-size woman with the tin box and the plain dress and made his calculation and turned away. Eleanor held that 2-second look in her mind and let it settle somewhere useful. She was going to need it in about an hour. William arrived 10 minutes before the meeting convened. He came in, found her, and sat in the chair beside her without ceremony, and the warmth of having someone next to her, actually next to her physically deliberately, was something Eleanor was not entirely prepared for. "How are you?" he said quietly. "Terrified," she said, "and ready. They're not the same thing." "No," he said. "They're not." She felt other eyes on them. She was aware of the murmur that moved through the room, the particular murmur of a small town, absorbing new information and immediately beginning to process it into opinion. William Carter was sitting beside Eleanor Whitmore. William Carter had chosen Eleanor Whitmore, the plain sister, the kitchen sister. She did not look around at the murmur. She looked at the front of the room, and she held the tin box, and she breathed. The council convened. The chairman, a man named Price who owed Caldwell 3 favors. Eleanor could enumerate from things she had overheard over years of being invisible in rooms where decisions were made, called the meeting to order with the kind of efficiency that signals someone who wants to get through an agenda quickly. Caldwell's lawyer spoke for 25 minutes. How was very good. Eleanor gave him that. He moved through the evidence, cleanly built the argument, methodically used the kind of language that made everything sound already settled, the kind of language designed not to persuade, but to make disagreement feel like an eccentricity. He cited the 1861 survey 3 times. He cited precedent. He cited Caldwell's decades of contribution to the county. He sat down to the sound of men nodding in the particular way of men who have been told what they already wanted to hear. Price looked at his notes. "Are there any other parties wishing to address the council?" Eleanor stood up. The room shifted. She heard it, the particular sound of a room full of people recalibrating. She heard someone at the back make a sound that was not quite a laugh. She heard a woman near the left wall say something very quietly to the woman beside her. She heard Price clear his throat. "Miss..." He looked at his notes. "Whitmore." "Yes," she said. "Are you here in an official capacity?" "I'm here as a resident of this county and a party with documented evidence relevant to this claim," she said. Her voice came out steady. She was grateful for that. "I have original survey documents executed by my grandfather, Abraham Whitmore, in 1847 and updated in 1871, which materially contradict the 1861 survey presented by Mr. Caldwell's counsel." Price looked at Caldwell. Caldwell looked at his lawyer. The lawyer stood up. "Mr. Chairman, I would object to the introduction of personal family documents without proper authentication. This kind of informal evidence. These documents were executed by a licensed surveyor," Eleanor said clearly, without raising her voice. "Abraham Whitmore held a surveying commission from the state of Kansas from 1841 until his death in 1876. His work has been cited in 17 documented county records. The authentication is in the documentation." She did not look at the lawyer. She looked at Price. "I'd like 5 minutes," she said. "Just 5. Price shifted in his chair. He looked at Caldwell again. Caldwell said in the measured voice of a man who has decided that making a scene about a woman with a tin box is beneath him and is willing to perform generosity because he believes it costs him nothing. "Let her speak, Matthew. We have nothing to hide." He was certain she had nothing. That was his mistake. Eleanor opened the tin box. She laid the first survey on the table in front of the council with the care of someone handling something that mattered, and she said, This is the 1847 survey of the Lower Willow Creek Valley, executed by Abraham Whitmore. You can see here, she pointed, and every eye in the room tracked her hand, that the primary spring is located in the valley basin. This is the originating water source for the streams that run both north and east of this property. She laid the second document beside it. This is the 1871 update following the geological event of 1869 that caused a realignment of the water table in this region. My grandfather noted here in his own hand that the spring went from seasonal to permanent as a result. The North Hill Stream, which Mr. Caldwell's 1861 survey identifies as his property's water source, is fed by this spring. It is downstream from the originating source. It is not the source. The room was very quiet. The lawyer was already on his feet. Mr. Chairman, these documents have not been independently verified. The geological event is corroborated, Eleanor said, and she reached into the tin box again. By the Kansas Geological Record of 1871, which documented 17 water table changes following the event. I have the relevant pages. She set them down. My grandfather's notation is consistent with the official record. A man in the second row said, "Where did she get all that?" Another man said, "That's Abe Whitmore's work. I recognize his notation style. I worked with Abe for 6 years." Eleanor looked up. She did not know the man. He was older, weathered, a working rancher by the look of him. He was leaning forward with his elbows on his knees and looking at the documents with an expression that was close to reverence. "I'm Walt Greer," the man said to the room at large. "I surveyed alongside Abraham Whitmore from 1860 to 1866. That's his hand. That's his dating convention. I'd swear to it in any court in Kansas." Caldwell's lawyer started to speak. Caldwell put a hand on his arm. The room started talking. It started slowly, the way a fire starts. A few voices, a few conversations, and then it grew into something Eleanor had not fully anticipated, which was the sound of people realizing together publicly that something they had been told was simply not true. She had expected resistance. She had expected procedural obstruction and dismissal, and the particular exhausting experience of being a woman who knows something in a room full of men who would prefer she didn't. She had not entirely expected Walt Greer. She had not expected the second man who stood up, a rancher named Peters, who said he had been telling his neighbors for 2 years that something was wrong with Caldwell's survey arithmetic, and nobody had listened to him. She had not expected Price to go still in his chair, with the expression of a man rapidly recalculating his obligations, because some obligations were based on certainty, and certainty had just shifted under his feet. She had not expected Caldwell to look at her. Not the 2-second dismissal. A longer look. A hard, assessing look. The look of a man who had made a calculation about a woman with a tin box and discovered his calculation was wrong and was deciding what to do about that. She held his gaze. She did not look away, because Eleanor Whitmore had spent 26 years looking away. From rooms she wasn't supposed to be noticed in. From conversations she wasn't supposed to be part of. From men who looked through her like she was furniture. She was done looking away. Caldwell looked away first. The meeting ran 40 minutes past its scheduled close. There was argument and counter-argument and procedural interruption, and a moment when Caldwell's lawyer stood up and started talking about defamation, until Price told him firmly to sit down, and a moment when Eleanor herself was interrupted 3 times in 5 minutes, and kept speaking anyway calmly, in the same measured voice. Not because she was not angry, but because she had promised herself that her anger was not going to give anyone an exit from the truth she was trying to make them face. William did not speak during the meeting. He sat beside her, and when she sat down between her turns at the front, he was there, present and steady, and once when the lawyer interrupted her the second time, with a particularly dismissive wave of his hand. She felt William's hand on the back of her chair, not touching her just there. The way a person stands in a doorway, not blocking, not pushing, just present, just saying without words, "I am not going anywhere." She needed it more than she had expected to. The council recessed to deliberate. Eleanor sat in her chair and did not move. The room around her filled with conversation and movement and the various social performances of people who had just witnessed something they were still deciding how to feel about. Women she did not know came over and said things like, "You were wonderful, and I didn't know about those surveys," which was kind. Men she recognized from town looked at her with expressions that ranged from impressed to unsettled, which was honest. Walter Greer came and shook her hand with both of his and said, "Abe would have loved this day. He absolutely would have." She managed to say thank you. She was still managing when William leaned over and said very quietly, just for her, "You didn't shake." "I did," she said. "On the inside." "Nobody saw it." "I saw it." "You still stood up there," he said. "In front of all of them, said every word." She looked at her hands in her lap. Steady now, but she remembered them on the edge of the table when the lawyer interrupted her the third time, remembered the specific physical discipline of keeping them still. "Yes," she said. "That's all that matters." "I know," she said. "I'm working on believing it." The council was back in 23 minutes, which was fast enough to tell Eleanor something had already been agreed before anyone left the room. Price returned to the table with the expression of a man who had been relieved of a weight he hadn't enjoyed carrying. Following review of the evidence presented today, Price said, "The council finds the documentation provided by Miss Eleanor Whitmore to be substantive and credible, consistent with corroborating geological records, and witnessed by a qualified professional familiar with the original surveyor's methodology. The claim of Mr. Richard Caldwell to exclusive water rights originating from the North Hill stream is not supported by the documentary evidence, and is accordingly denied." He kept talking procedural language, next steps, formal review process, but Eleanor stopped hearing the words. She heard the room instead, the sound of it, the way it changed the collective exhale, the murmur of relief from the ranchers along the walls who had been watching this proceeding with the tight faces of men with everything to lose, the sound of two women near the back who said something to each other and then just held each other's hands. The particular quiet of Richard Caldwell, who did not move or speak, but sat in his chair with his lawyer, and looked at the front of the room with an expression Eleanor was certain no one in Willow Creek had ever seen on his face before. Defeat. Undisguised and unmanaged. Eleanor sat in her chair and let it settle over her like the end of something she had been holding herself against for a very long time. Beside her, William said nothing. He just reached over and set his hand over hers on the tin box. She turned her hand and held his. Just for a moment. Just long enough. Then the room was moving around them, people standing, the council dispersing. Walter Greer's voice booming somewhere at the back, and Eleanor straightened in her chair and began carefully, precisely returning her grandfather's documents to the tin box one by one, the way you handle things that matter. She did not let herself think too far ahead. Not about what came next, not about the man sitting beside her, or the look on her father's face when she came home, or the questions that would follow this day into the days after it. She thought about her grandfather, about a man who had taken time and care over a true thing and trusted it to his granddaughter because she was the one who paid attention. She thought about the tin box buried in the barn at 13. She thought about today, and she let herself carefully, the way she let herself do most things quietly with both hands, without making a performance of it, feel something that was not quite triumph and not quite relief, and was closer than anything she had ever held in her chest to the feeling of being exactly where she was supposed to be. The tin box sat on the kitchen shelf now. Eleanor had moved it from its hiding place the morning after the meeting, taken it out from under the loose board behind the pantry, set it on the shelf where she kept her grandmother's good dishes, and left it there in plain sight. It was a small thing. Nobody else noticed it or remarked upon it. But every morning when she came into the kitchen before dawn to start the coffee, she saw it, and she felt something that took her a while to name. She felt like herself, not the version of herself she had been performing for 26 years. The quiet one, the useful one, the woman who stayed in the background and made sure everyone else had a full cup. The actual one, the one who had buried those surveys at 13 because she knew they mattered. The one who had read her grandfather's maps until she understood them better than anyone living. The one who had stood in front of a county council and said the true thing, and not shaken, or not visibly anyway, which she was beginning to understand counted for something. That woman had always existed. She had simply been kept very busy in the kitchen, The week after the meeting was strange, in the way that the aftermath of significant events is always strange. Not the dramatic strangeness of crisis, but the quiet strangeness of ordinary life, continuing around something that has permanently changed the shape of things. Neighbors who had never spoken to her at the general store now stopped her on the street. Women who had looked through her for years now looked at her with something that mixed genuine warmth with the particular awkwardness of people who know they should have been paying attention earlier and aren't quite sure how to account for the gap. She received 3 letters in 1 week, 2 from ranching families thanking her for what she had done at the meeting. 1 from a woman she didn't know in the next county who had heard about it third hand, and wrote to say she wished there had been someone like Eleanor at a meeting she'd attended 2 years ago about her own family's land. She read all 3 letters at the kitchen table and then put them in the tin box with her grandfather's surveys. William came on Tuesday as he usually did, but he also came on Saturday, which was outside their pattern. She noticed the difference without commenting on it. He was working something out. She could tell there was a quality to his silences when he was working something out, a deliberateness, like a man checking his footing before he commits his full weight to a step. She gave him room for it because she understood the feeling. They were sitting at the kitchen table, the tin box between them, as it often was, now not because they needed the surveys for anything, but because it had become a kind of anchor for their conversations. A physical reminder of the thing that had started all of this when he said without preamble, "I want to talk to you about the ranch." Eleanor looked up from her coffee. "Not the water rights," he said. "The ranch itself. What it is and what I've been trying to make it." He paused in the way he paused when he was choosing words. "May and I had plans for it. We were going to expand the south pasture, put in a proper irrigation channel from the valley spring, which as it happens, we are now in a significantly better position to do, build a second barn." He stopped. "After she died, I stopped planning. I just maintained. Kept the thing running because it needed running, but I stopped thinking about what it could be." Another pause. "I've been thinking again. Recently." Eleanor held her cup in both hands. "What have you been thinking?" "That I don't want to do it alone anymore," he said. "Not just the thinking, any of it." He met her eyes. "I'm not saying this the way a man says it when he wants a housekeeper with a better contract. I want you to understand the difference." "I understand the difference," she said. "I know you do," he said. "That's why I'm saying it to you and not to a room full of people." She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had walked into her family's parlor, looking for a conventional choice, and had somehow arrived here at her kitchen table with the tin box, talking about the future, the way people talk about the future when they are including you in it. "William," she said, "I need to tell you something." "All right." "I am not May." He went very still. "I am not saying that unkindly," she said carefully, because she could see that it had landed hard, and she wanted to handle that with the precision it deserved. "I am saying it because I think it matters for you to be sure about what you're choosing. May was a woman you built something with from the beginning. I'm coming into the middle of something that already has her shape in it. And I don't want to spend the next 10 years feeling like I'm inhabiting a space that belongs to someone else." She set down her cup. "I need to know that you see me, Eleanor, not the idea of having someone again." The silence lasted long enough that Eleanor's heart did something uncomfortable. Then William said, "The first thing I noticed about you was your hands." She blinked. "In the kitchen," he said. "The first day. Your hands on the coffee pot. They were completely steady while everything else in that room was performing. Charlotte was performing. Your father was performing. Even your mother was performing. And you were just doing a thing that needed doing with steady hands." He paused. "I spent 11 years watching May's hands. I know what steady hands look like on a person who means what they're doing." He looked at her directly. "I see you, Eleanor. I've been seeing you since the first 10 minutes I was in your family's house. The question is whether you'll let yourself be seen." Eleanor breathed. "That," she said finally, "is an unfair thing to say." "I know," he said. "Is it wrong?" She looked at the tin box. She looked at him. "No," she said quietly. "It isn't wrong." He proposed to her on a Wednesday. Not on one knee, not the performative gesture, the borrowed romantic convention, but standing at the fence line where they had first talked in the same gold-edged evening light with the same straightforwardness that characterized everything he said to her. He told her he wanted to marry her. He told her what that meant to him, not in abstract terms, not in the language of formal proposals, but in specifics: partnership, honesty, the south pasture, the irrigation channel, the plans he had stopped making and wanted to start again. He told her he was not asking because she was convenient or available, or because she had proven useful in a public situation. He told her he was asking because sitting across from her at the kitchen table was the most at home he had felt in 4 years. She said yes. Not immediately. She stood at the fence for about 30 seconds, first looking at the road and breathing, because she was a practical woman, and she felt that the gravity of a thing deserved the space of 30 seconds before you answered it. Then she said yes. The wedding was small, which suited them both. A minister, the necessary witnesses Eleanor in her grandmother's blue dress, with her hair done the way she usually wore it because she had stopped apologizing for who she was, and it seemed inconsistent to start again on a day that was supposed to be about exactly that. William stood beside her with the specific quality of stillness she had come to know as his version of feeling. Something deeply, not performance, not display. Just the absolute presence of a man who means what he is doing, her mother cried. Charlotte stood very straight and kept her expression composed and hugged Eleanor afterward with a fierceness that surprised them both. "Be happy," Charlotte said into her ear, low and genuine. "I mean it. Be genuinely happy, Eleanor, not just adequately happy." Eleanor held on to her sister for a moment. "I know you mean it," she said. Amelia cried, the way Amelia cried at everything openly and without self-consciousness, and grabbed Eleanor's hands and said, "You look like yourself. You actually look like yourself." Eleanor laughed, which she hadn't expected to do, and the laugh felt clean and unmanaged, and it might have been the best moment of the entire day. Her father shook William's hand and said very little, which was his language, and Eleanor had learned to read it. She was still learning to let it be enough. The Carter Ranch was everything William had described, and several things he hadn't. It was large in the way that working land is large, not decorative, not landscaped, but wide and functional, and demanding a place that required daily attention, and returned that attention in the form of something that worked. The main house had been built well and maintained practically, which suited Eleanor, and there were empty rooms she moved through slowly in the first days, taking their measure, understanding their history, deciding which things to keep and which to let go of. She did not change everything at once. She had been the woman in the background long enough to understand the damage of coming into a space and immediately asserting yourself over everything that existed before. She moved carefully and deliberately, and William watched her do it with an expression she had begun to read fluently, the one that meant he was noticing something he respected. The kitchen she made her own within the first week. She could not help that. The kitchen was where she thought best, and she needed to think clearly because there was a great deal to understand about the ranch's operations, and Eleanor had no intention of being a rancher's wife who understood only the inside of the house. Within 2 weeks, she had walked the south pasture with Jonas Briggs, who had accepted her presence with the efficient practicality of a man who had worked for William long enough to trust William's judgment about what mattered. Within 3 weeks, she had located 3 additional water sources on Carter land that had not been properly documented, mapped them in her own notation, and placed the maps in the tin box alongside her grandfather's surveys. William found her at the table with the maps one evening and stood in the doorway for a long moment, just looking. "You've been busy," he said. "The South Creek has 2 tributaries. Your last survey didn't capture," she said. "If you're planning the irrigation channel, you'll want to route it through the eastern tributary. The flow rate is higher, and it won't conflict with the spring pasture drainage." He sat down across from her. He looked at the maps. He looked at her. "Jonas said you asked about the cattle rotation schedule yesterday," he said. "I did." He seemed surprised. "He recovered quickly," she said. "He's a practical man." William was quiet for a moment. "Eleanor." She looked up. "I want to say something without you telling me not to be kind about it." She set down her pencil. "You are the best thing that has happened to this ranch in 4 years," he said. "Possibly ever. And I am aware that you have been exactly this person your entire life, and nobody gave you room to be it. And I am aware that I cannot fix that. But I want you to know that I see it. All of it. Not just the water surveys, not just the council meeting." He paused. "You." Eleanor sat very still. The thing about William Carter she had learned was that he meant things all the way through. There was no bottom to his honesty where it turned out he was performing. He said true things because they were true, and he said them in the same quiet way. He did everything without drama, without needing credit for the saying, which somehow made them heavier than the dramatic declarations she had read about in the books her mother used to keep on the parlor shelf and never actually read. "I'm learning," she said finally, "to not immediately look for the reason that isn't true." I know," he said. "You're getting better at it." "I have good practice material," she said. He smiled, the full one, not the one around the corners of his mouth. She loved that smile with a ferocity she was still getting used to feeling. But that was 3 months ago. The trouble began in the 4th month. It began as trouble often does, not with a dramatic event, but with small things happening in a sequence that only looked like a pattern after enough of them had accumulated. Jonas mentioned that a man had been asking questions at the feed store about Carter water rights. William received a letter from a Wichita lawyer Eleanor had never heard of, but recognized immediately as Caldwell's second firm, the one he kept at a distance, so the first firm's defeat didn't attach to it. 2 of the neighboring ranchers who had nodded to her at the water meeting now looked past her on the street. She said nothing for 2 weeks. Then she said, "He isn't finished." William was at the table. He did not pretend not to know who she meant. "No," he said. "He isn't." "The letter from the Wichita lawyer," she said. "What did it say?" "That Caldwell intends to challenge the survey evidence on authentication grounds." He paused. "He's claiming the 1871 document is a forgery." The word hit the room like something dropped from a height. Eleanor sat down. "A forgery," she said. "He has a documents expert from Topeka who will testify that the aging on the paper is inconsistent with 1871. William's voice was measured, but his jaw was tight in the way it got when he was controlling something. "He's claiming someone doctored the document and introduced it as evidence fraudulently." The silence lasted 5 seconds. "He's claiming I forged my grandfather's work," Eleanor said. "Yes." She stood up. She walked to the kitchen window and put her hands on the sill and stood there looking out, breathing through the thing that was happening in her chest. It was not the sick heaviness of doubt. She had no doubt about the surveys, not a particle of it. It was something older than doubt. It was the particular fury of a woman who has been correct and proven it, and still finds that the world has found another mechanism to dismiss her. She had expected resistance. She had not expected this specific form of it. "What does he need for the forgery claim to hold?" she said without turning around. "He needs to discredit the document itself," William said. "The authentication Walt Greer provided was oral witness valuable, but vulnerable. If Caldwell can produce expert testimony that contradicts the paper's physical properties, the council review will have to weigh competing expert opinions." He paused. "And Caldwell's expert is expensive and well-credentialed, and the council has certain members who would not be unhappy for a reason to reconsider." Eleanor turned around. "Who is the documents expert?" "A man named Hartley, Jacob Hartley. He does authentication work for land courts in 3 states. She thought. She thought the way she thought about the surveys methodically, from the ground up, laying one fact next to another, and seeing what shape they made. "Hartley worked a case in Sedgwick County in 1877, she said slowly. "A disputed will. He authenticated a document that was later proven fraudulent by the Wichita Historical Society's records." William stared at her. "How do you know that?" "I read everything about land law in Kansas that I could get my hands on after the council meeting," she said. "I thought Caldwell might come back. I wanted to understand what he might use." She paused. "I didn't anticipate this specific angle, but I read about Hartley." The silence in the kitchen had a different quality now. "Eleanor," William said, "the case in Sedgwick County. Is there documentation?" There will be, she said, in the Wichita court records, and in the Historical Society's files. She was already at the shelf, already pulling down the notebook where she kept her reference notes, because Eleanor Whitmore Carter did not simply read things she wrote down where she had read them in case she needed to go back. If Hartley's credibility can be challenged, the expert testimony loses its weight. And if the expert testimony loses its weight, there is no forgery claim. William stood up. "I'll send Jonas to Wichita tomorrow," he said. "Send me," Eleanor said. He looked at her. "It needs to be me," she said. "I know what I'm looking for. I know exactly which records. Jonas is a good man, and I trust him, but he doesn't know the notation systems, and he doesn't know the case details. I do." She met his eyes. "Send me." He held her gaze for a long moment. "All right," he said. She was on the road to Wichita in 2 days. Jonas drove. Eleanor rode with the notebook on her lap and her grandfather's surveys in the tin box which she did not let out of her sight. They did not talk much. Jonas was not a man who talked for the sake of it, which she appreciated, and she needed her mind clear for what was ahead. She had been to Wichita 3 times in her life. The county seat was big in a way that Willow Creek was not the overwhelming size of an eastern city, but the specific busy scale of a town that was growing faster than it had planned for, with new buildings going up alongside older ones, and a noise level that increased steadily as they came into the center. The court records office was in a building that smelled like paper and lye, and the specific mustiness of documents that have been filed and not looked at for years, which Eleanor found comforting in the way of familiar things. The clerk was a young man who looked at her with mild surprise when she explained what she needed, and then when she explained it in enough specific detail that he understood she knew exactly what she was looking for, shifted to the expression of someone who has decided to simply be helpful. It took 4 hours. She found the Sedgwick County will case in the 3rd box the clerk brought her. She found Hartley's authentication report. She found the Historical Society's rebuttal, which was thorough and scathing, and documented in the kind of careful, methodical language that was either going to be very useful or very complicated, depending on who was reading it. Then she found something she had not been looking for. In the back of the case file, in a collection of correspondence that had been filed without full indexing, there was a letter. It was from Richard Caldwell. It was dated 1877. It was addressed to Jacob Hartley. It was 2 paragraphs long. The first paragraph discussed a piece of land in Sedgwick County that Caldwell had an interest in acquiring. The second paragraph discussed Hartley's authentication services and included a figure that was not labeled as a standard professional fee. Eleanor sat very still with the letter in her hands. Then she read it again. Then she called for the clerk and asked him in the most even voice she could manage whether she could obtain a certified copy of this correspondence, along with the case documentation. The clerk looked at the letter. His expression changed. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "are you aware of what this says?" "Yes," she said. "That's why I need a copy." She rode back to Willow Creek with the certified copies in the tin box, pressed flat against her grandfather's surveys. Jonas drove and did not ask questions because Jonas had the gift of understanding when questions were not what a situation required. She was back before dark. William was waiting on the porch. She got down from the wagon and walked up to him and handed him the tin box without speaking. He opened it. He read. She watched his face as he read, watched the controlled expression. He usually maintained shift into something unguarded, something that was anger and something beyond anger. The specific expression of a man who has seen enough of the world to recognize corruption when it is documented in someone's own handwriting. "He paid Hartley in 1877, William said. "Yes. For an authentication that was later proven fraudulent." "Yes. And now he has hired the same man to challenge your grandfather's surveys." "Yes." She paused. "And that letter puts Caldwell's name on Hartley's previous misconduct. It doesn't prove the current authentication is bought. But it establishes a pattern, and it establishes a relationship, and any council member who reads it will have to decide whether to proceed with Hartley's testimony, knowing that history." William looked at her. He looked at her the way he had looked at the surveys the first time she had spread them on the table, not just seeing them, but absorbing them, understanding their weight. You found this on your own, he said. I was looking for the Sedgwick case. This was in the same file. Eleanor. He closed the tin box. This is what you've done here. I know what I've done, she said, and her voice was steady, and she meant the steadiness. I read everything I could find because I knew he would come back. Because that is what people like Caldwell do. They retreat and reorganize and come back with a different mechanism. I wasn't going to be unprepared for it. She paused. I am not going to let him make me feel like what I know isn't real. William was silent for a moment. Then he said quietly and completely, No, you're not. She sat down on the porch step because her legs were tired from 2 days of travel and her mind had been running hard for 48 hours, and she was not defeated. Never that, but the particular kind of exhausted that comes from holding yourself to a very high standard for a very long time without setting it down. William sat beside her. Not across from her. Beside her. On the porch step in the evening with the tin box between them and the sound of the ranch settling around them. They sat there for a while without talking. Then he said, I need to tell you something about the ranch. She looked at him. His voice had a quality that made her straighten. 3 weeks ago, he said slowly, Caldwell made me an offer for the south pasture, the acreage that runs adjacent to the valley spring. He paused. He offered twice the market value. Eleanor was very still. You didn't tell me. I turned it down the same day, and I didn't think it was worth worrying you, he said. But given what you found, given this letter, I think I underestimated what he was doing. The south pasture offer wasn't about the pasture. It was about getting access to the spring from Carterland. He looked at her. If he owned that pasture, he could redirect the water argument entirely. He wouldn't need to fight the survey claim. He'd own a section of the land adjacent to the originating source and could make a new claim from there. Eleanor processed this. He was hedging, she said. The forgery claim was one strategy. Buying the pasture was another. He was running both at the same time. Yes. And if you had sold, I didn't. But if you had, Eleanor, he said firmly, looking at her. I didn't. I would not. That land is part of what supplies water to 6 neighboring families, and I knew that before you told me, and I am not Richard Caldwell. I don't sell the things that belong to other people's livelihoods. She breathed. I know that, she said. I know you're not him. I should have told you about the offer, he said. That's on me. I was trying to protect you from one more thing to manage, and that was the wrong decision. I'm telling you now because what you found in Wichita means I understand this situation better than I did, and I should have been giving you all of it from the beginning. She looked at the tin box between them. I'm your partner, she said, not a person you protect from information. I know that, he said. I'm still learning what that looks like in practice. She turned that over. It was honest. It was genuinely honest, the acknowledgement of a man who was not claiming to be perfect, but was willing to say where he had fallen short and mean it. All right, she said. All right. I'll take the honest accounting, she said. Don't do it again. I won't, he said. They were quiet again. Then Eleanor said, He's going to come back a third time, after the letter. He's going to find another angle. Probably, William said. Then we need to move first. She picked up the tin box and held it on her knees. We need to present this to the council before he has a chance to file the authentication challenge formally. If we get there first with the Sedgwick documentation and the letter, we control the sequence. He's spent 30 years controlling the sequence. He counts on it. She paused. I want to take that away from him. The wind moved through the dark around them. William looked at her for a long moment. You know, he said, when I walked into your family's parlor 4 months ago, I was expecting a woman who could manage a household and have a decent conversation. And I got someone who is quietly running circles around the most powerful man in 3 counties. He paused. I was not prepared for that. Nobody ever is, Eleanor said, and the flatness of it made him laugh, and the laugh was real and warm and cut through the weight of the evening, like something she needed more than she had known. She leaned her shoulder against his. He didn't move away. They sat on the porch of the Carter Ranch in the dark, with the tin box full of surveys and letters, and the documented shape of a truth that a powerful man had spent considerable resources trying to erase, and Eleanor felt the fear still there. She was honest enough with herself to feel it, but the fear had company now. The fear had her grandfather's careful handwriting, and Walt Greer's recognition, and a room full of ranching families who had exhaled when the council ruled, and the letter in Caldwell's own hand, and a man sitting beside her on a porch step who had told her she deserved honest and was still here, still next to her, still learning. She was still learning too. They were learning at the same time, which was the most terrifying and the most clarifying thing she had discovered about what it meant to actually be with someone. You did not arrive finished. You arrived honest, and you worked from there. And Eleanor Whitmore Carter had always been better at working than anyone had given her credit for. They moved fast. Eleanor had learned watching Richard Caldwell operate through the months since the first meeting that the man's primary advantage was sequence. He chose the timing. He controlled when things were introduced, when information surfaced, when pressure was applied. He had done it at the first council meeting by securing the agenda. He had done it with the forgery claim by filing through the Wichita lawyer before anyone knew he was coming. His power was not simply money, though the money was real. His power was that he always moved first and made everyone else respond to him. Eleanor intended to end that. She and William were at the kitchen table by 5 in the morning 2 days after she had returned from Wichita with the letter. The tin box was open between them. She had the certified copies laid out in order: the Sedgwick case file, Hartley's original authentication, the Historical Society's rebuttal, and the letter. The letter in Caldwell's own handwriting in his own words, with the figure that was not a professional fee. "We need Price," William said. "Price won't move without the full council," Eleanor said. "And we can't call the full council without a formal petition. That takes 10 days minimum." "We don't have 10 days, William said. "Caldwell's lawyer files the authentication challenge on Friday." "Then we don't go through Price." Eleanor looked at the letter. "We go through Harmon." William was quiet for a beat. David Harmon was the council member Caldwell had not managed to buy. Eleanor had worked this out over weeks of careful observation. The way Harmon voted, the particular expression on his face when Caldwell's lawyer spoke, the fact that he had been the first to call for the recess at the first meeting. He was not a dramatic man. He did not make speeches. But he voted against Caldwell 3 times in the past 2 years in ways that had cost him socially, and he had not reversed himself, which told Eleanor something about his character that mattered considerably right now. "Harmon is cautious," William said. "Good," Eleanor said. "Cautious men read documents carefully before they dismiss them. He's also not going to want to move against Caldwell without cover. The letter is cover." She tapped the certified copy. "This isn't opinion. It isn't interpretation. It's Caldwell's handwriting and Caldwell's money going to Hartley in a case where Hartley's authentication was later proven false. If Harmon takes this to Price, Price has to act. Because if Price doesn't act, and this letter comes out in the challenge proceedings, Price is the man who knew about Caldwell's history with Hartley and still let the testimony stand." William looked at her. "You've been thinking about this since Wichita," he said. "I've been thinking about this since the day Caldwell looked at me for 2 seconds in the meeting hall and decided I wasn't a problem," she said. "I told myself then I was going to make sure he had enough time to regret that." She sent a message to Harmon that afternoon through Jonas, who had the advantage of being known and trusted throughout the county as a man who did not involve himself in things unnecessarily. The message was brief. She was not going to explain it in writing. She asked for a meeting and said only that it concerned the authentication challenge and that she had documentation she believed he would want to see before Friday. Harmon arrived the following morning. He came alone, which was deliberate, a cautious man's way of saying, "I'm listening," without committing to anything. He was in his 60s, with a lean face and the specific manner of someone who had spent years making decisions with incomplete information and had developed a deep preference for completeness. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at the documents Eleanor laid before him, in order without touching them, reading each one with the unhurried attention of a man who understood that what he was looking at mattered. He read the letter last. He read it twice. Then he sat back in his chair and said, "How did you find this?" "It was in the Sedgwick case file," Eleanor said. "Filed with the correspondence but not fully indexed. I found it because I was looking for the right things." "And you've had this authenticated?" "The clerk provided certified copies. I can provide the originating file reference and the clerk's name if you need to verify independently." Harmon looked at the letter for another moment. Then he looked at Eleanor. Mrs. Carter." He corrected himself with a small nod. "I want to ask you something directly." "Please do." "What do you want from this?" Eleanor looked at him steadily. "I want the water to belong to the people it has always belonged to, she said. "I want Hartley's testimony disqualified before it can be used to undo what the council already correctly decided. And I want Richard Caldwell to understand that buying the outcome of a public process is not something he can do in this county without consequence." She paused. "That's all." "That's not a small thing," Harmon said. "No," she said. "It isn't." Howe was quiet for a long moment. "If I take this to Price," he said slowly, "and Price moves to block the authentication challenge before Friday, Caldwell will know immediately that someone went around him. He will know it came from you." "I know that," Eleanor said. "He will not." Harmon chose his words. "He is not a man who accepts being outmaneuvered quietly." "I know that too." "You're not afraid of that." It was not quite a question. Eleanor answered it anyway. "I'm afraid of quite a lot of things, Mr. Harmon. But I've found that being afraid of something and being stopped by it are different situations, and I have more experience than I'd like with letting the second one masquerade as the first." Harmon looked at her for a long moment. Then something in his face shifted. Not warmth exactly, but recognition. The specific recognition of someone who has spent a long time trying to do the right thing in a room that makes it difficult and has just encountered someone else who knows what that costs. "I'll go to Price this afternoon," he said. He left with certified copies of everything. Eleanor stood at the window and watched him ride out, and then stood there for a while longer, not moving, just breathing. "Well," said William from the doorway. "Well," she said. "That was either very smart or very fast," he said. "Possibly both." "We'll know by Thursday," she said. They knew by Wednesday. Harmon moved faster than Eleanor had anticipated, which she took as a sign that he had been waiting for exactly this kind of leverage and had not wasted a minute once she had given it to him. Price called an emergency council session for Wednesday evening. Eleanor and William were not invited, which was correct. This was a procedural session, not a public hearing, but Jonas had a cousin on the building staff, and Jonas's cousin reported back within 2 hours of the session's close. The authentication challenge was suspended pending review of the Hartley-Caldwell correspondence. The formal council ruling would follow within 10 days. But the challenge was suspended, which meant it could not be filed on Friday, which meant the original survey ruling remained in force while the review proceeded. Caldwell had been outmaneuvered. Eleanor got this information standing in the kitchen from Jonas, who delivered it with the economy of a man who understood its significance without requiring commentary on it. She thanked him. He nodded and left. She stood at the kitchen counter for a moment, with her hands flat on the surface. Then she sat down at the table and put her face in her hands and let herself feel the full weight of the relief, which was enormous, she was discovering the actual size of the thing she had been holding herself against for months, measured now by how much space it took up when she finally let it down. She was still sitting like that when William came in. He didn't say anything. He sat down across from her and waited. After a moment, she lifted her face. Her eyes were dry. She had not cried. She was not sure what she had done exactly, except experience something large passing through her. "It's not over," she said. "No," he said. "But it's different now. He's going to come back." "He might," William said. "Or he might decide that the return cost more than the gain. Caldwell is many things, but he is not irrational. He has other interests, other counties. If this one becomes expensive enough in the wrong ways..." He stopped. That letter in his own hand, that changes his calculation. Eleanor considered that. "You think he'll stop?" "I think he'll reassess," William said. "Which is as much as we can ask for." She looked at the tin box. "My grandfather mapped that spring in 1847, she said. He was alone out there with his equipment and his notation book in a valley nobody else thought was worth the time to document carefully. He did it because it was true, and because true things deserve to be recorded." She paused. "He never knew it would matter like this." "He knew it would matter," William said quietly. "That's why he taught you." She looked at him. "He didn't teach your father," William said. "He didn't teach Charlotte or your mother or anyone else in that house. He taught you. Because you were the one who paid attention, and he knew it, and he gave you the thing that mattered most." He met her eyes. He knew exactly what he was doing. Eleanor sat with that. She had never thought of it quite that way. She had thought of the surveys as something she had saved, something she had preserved. She had not thought of herself as the person her grandfather had specifically and intentionally entrusted them to. Those were different things. Very different things. She opened the tin box and looked at his handwriting. The careful loops. The precise notations. The way he dated each entry in the top right corner because he said dates were how you proved a thing happened when you said it happened. He had been teaching her that for years, and she had not known that was the lesson. She closed the box. Thursday passed quietly. Friday passed more quietly still, with the significance of a deadline that did not arrive, a challenge that was not filed, a mechanism that had been stopped before it could be deployed. Eleanor felt the quiet of it as a physical thing. Saturday morning brought Charlotte. She arrived at the Carter Ranch without sending word ahead, which was unusual for Charlotte, who was a woman who preferred to control the terms of every entrance she made. She came in the wagon with their mother's driver, and Eleanor met her at the door and took one look at her face and said, "Come inside." They sat in the kitchen. Eleanor's kitchen, which was different from the kitchen at the Whitmore house in ways that were partly physical and partly something else, and Charlotte had tea she didn't drink and kept turning the cup in her hands the way Eleanor had never seen her do before because Charlotte did not fidget. "He came to see Father," Charlotte said. Eleanor went still. "Caldwell," Charlotte said. "2 days ago. He came to the house and he sat in our parlor and he was very cordial. The way Father always says about him, and he asked Father about the survey documents. He wanted to know if Father had any recollection of the originals before Eleanor." She stopped. "Before you removed them from the house." "They were always mine," Eleanor said. "Grandfather left them to me specifically." "I know that," Charlotte said. "I told him that." Eleanor stared at her. Charlotte set down the cup. "He was implying that you had taken them without permission, that they were family property, and you had removed them for your own purposes." Her voice had gone flat and precise in the way it did when she was angry about something she was managing. "I told him that our grandfather's documentation and his disposition of his own property was a matter of record, and that the family had no claim to documents left specifically to Eleanor, and that I strongly suggested he take that argument elsewhere." The kitchen was very quiet. "You said that," Eleanor said. "To Caldwell." "Yes." "Charlotte." "Don't," Charlotte said, and for just a moment her composure came apart at the edges, and something raw and tired showed through underneath. "Don't make it something large. I said the true thing to someone who needed to hear it. You've been doing that your whole life apparently, and I have been perfectly capable of it all along and simply chose not to be." She pressed her lips together. It was past time. Eleanor looked at her sister. At this woman, who had spent her whole life in the front room, being the version of a Whitmore daughter that was presentable and who had learned to perform that role so well, that Eleanor had sometimes forgot there was a person underneath it who had her own reckonings to make. "What did Father say?" Eleanor asked. "He told Caldwell he didn't recall the specifics of the grandfather's will," Charlotte said. "Which is technically true because Father never paid attention to grandfather's will in the first place. But he said it in the right direction, if that makes sense. He was vague in a way that didn't help Caldwell." "That's 2 Whitmores who've deflected Caldwell in his own interest," Eleanor said slowly. "Apparently, we are less useless than previously advertised," Charlotte said with a dryness that was so purely Charlotte that Eleanor almost laughed. She didn't quite, but it was close. "How are things at the house?" Eleanor asked, because she realized she had not asked that in long enough that the asking had weight. Charlotte was quiet for a moment. "Different," she said. "Since you left, since the meeting, people look at us differently, the Whitmore family, like we might be worth knowing for reasons other than the obvious ones." She paused. "I don't entirely know what to do with that." "You learned to take up the space," Eleanor said. Charlotte looked at her. "Is that what you did?" "I'm still learning," Eleanor said. "But yes, that's the direction." Charlotte stayed for lunch. They ate together at the kitchen table and talked not about the water rights or Caldwell or the council, but about other things, smaller things. The things sisters talk about when they have stopped performing at each other and started actually being in the same room. It was not easy. 26 years of learned distance did not dissolve over one lunch. But it was honest, which Eleanor had learned to value more than easy. After Charlotte left, Eleanor stood on the porch and watched the wagon go and felt something she did not immediately have a word for. Not reconciliation, that was too finished a word for something still in process. Something closer to the beginning of a bridge. A first plank properly laid. It would do for now. The formal council ruling came 8 days later. It was delivered in writing, which Eleanor read, standing at the kitchen counter, because she could not make herself sit down for it. The language was procedural and exact. The Hartley authentication was disqualified on grounds of undisclosed prior relationship between the authenticator and the interested party. The original survey evidence remained valid. The Caldwell water claim was formally denied with prejudice, meaning it could not be refiled on the same grounds. With prejudice. She read those 2 words 3 times. Then she set the paper down on the counter and put both hands flat on the surface and breathed. It was done. Not the way things are done in stories, with a dramatic crescendo and a clear moment of triumph that everyone recognizes at the same instant. It was done the way real things get done, slowly, incrementally, through the accumulation of small, true actions over time, until the thing you were working toward was simply present, solid, and undeniable, and you looked up and realized it had arrived while you were too busy working to notice. The spring was the valley's. The water belonged to the families who had always depended on it. Richard Caldwell's claim was closed. William found her at the counter. He read the ruling. He set it back down. He looked at her. "How do you feel?" he said. "Tired," she said honestly. "And I don't know yet. I think I need a few days to find out how I feel." "That's fair," he said. "I thought it would feel bigger," she said. "I thought there would be a moment where it was very clear that it was over, and I would know what to feel." "Does it feel over?" She thought about it. "It feels resolved," she said. "That's different from over. Over implies there was a story with an ending. This is just life, continuing, with something terrible removed from it that was there before." He was quiet for a moment. "That might be the most accurate thing anyone has said about winning a fight," he said. She turned the ruling over in her hands, looked at her name on it, Eleanor Whitmore Carter, written in the council's formal notation alongside the survey documentation as the source of the evidence that had decided the case. Her name, on a legal ruling, in the county record, where it would stay. She set it down carefully and picked up the tin box which was on the counter beside her, and she opened it and placed the ruling inside on top of her grandfather's surveys and closed the lid. "I want to tell Jonas," she said. "He's been carrying this too." "He's in the south pasture," William said. "I'll ride out with you." They found Jonas at the fence line of the south pasture, the one Caldwell had tried to buy, doing the methodical work of a man who had been doing it for 20 years and would do it for 20 more because the work was real and the work mattered. He looked up when they rode over. He looked at Eleanor's face. He looked at William's. "It's done," Eleanor said. Jonas was quiet for a moment. He took off his hat and held it against his chest and looked at the pasture and the land that ran toward the valley below it, where the spring her grandfather had mapped in 1847 was still running, still feeding the streams that 6 families depended on. "Abe Whitmore would have been glad," he said. "That's the second time someone has said that to me," Eleanor said. "Then it's true twice over," Jonas said. He put his hat back on. "Good work, Mrs. Carter." I went back to the fence. Eleanor sat on her horse and looked at the land. She thought about something her grandfather had told her once when she was very young, young enough that she had stored the words without fully understanding them, carried them through the years, until she had lived enough to know what they meant. He had said the land doesn't care who claims it. It only cares who understands it. She had understood this land. She had carried its truth in a tin box for 13 years because she was 13 years old, and she already understood what it meant, and she already knew in the wordless way of children who pay attention that truth needed protecting or it would be lost. That girl had grown into this woman. This woman had brought the truth back out. She looked at William beside her. He was looking at the land too, with the expression of a man who has come back to something he thought he might have lost. Not the land specifically, the feeling of it, the sense of a future on it. "The irrigation channel," she said. He looked at her. "What about it?" "I've been thinking about the route," she said. "I want to show you what I found in the survey follow-up. The eastern tributary runs closer to the south pasture than you thought. If we route through the lower field and use gravity feed instead of a pump mechanism, you could irrigate a third more acreage, and the maintenance would be—" "Eleanor," William said. She stopped. Howe was looking at her with that expression. The one she had first seen at the fence line of the Whitmore property in the gold-edged evening, before she knew what his expressions meant. The one she had come to understand was his version of feeling something too large for his usual economy of words. "I love you," he said. She had not expected it in that moment. She had thought when it came, it would come differently with more ceremony, more preamble in the way of the romantic conventions she had read about and always found slightly implausible. Not interrupted in the middle of a discussion about irrigation engineering, which was, she thought, exactly right. "You love me," she said. "Yes. While I'm talking about gravity-fed irrigation." "Particularly then," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said quietly and completely, with both hands steady and her eyes clear, and all the weight of 26 years of being invisible burned down into something simple and true. "I love you too." The wind moved through the south pasture. The land stretched out around them wide and real and demanding. The way good things are demanding not because they want to take from you, but because they deserve what you bring to them. Eleanor held the tin box across the saddle in front of her, the ruling inside. Her grandfather's maps, the letters and the surveys, and the accumulated weight of a truth that had waited a long time to be heard. She was not standing in the background. She was not making sure everyone else had a full cup. She was here in the middle of it, and the world had not ended when she took up that space, and the people who mattered had not turned away, and the work was not done, but it was real, and it was hers. She was not the woman nobody chose. She was the woman who had been here all along, waiting to be given room, taking the room anyway. The irrigation channel took 4 months to build. Eleanor had designed the route herself. The eastern tributary, feed the gravity system, the placement of the diversion points to maximize coverage without disrupting the natural water flow that the neighboring ranches downstream depended on. She had drawn it out on paper, the same way her grandfather drew his surveys, precisely with dates with notations, explaining each decision so that someone reading it 20 years later would understand not just what she had done, but why. William had looked at the finished plans and said, "This is better than what the county engineer proposed in 1878. The county engineer in 1878 didn't account for the eastern tributary, Eleanor said, and he was working from the wrong survey. "Caldwell's survey," William said. "Yes," she said, "which is why everything he proposed was wrong from the start." Jonas oversaw the construction with a crew of 8, including 2 men from neighboring families who contributed their labor because they understood that the channel benefited everyone, and because Eleanor had explained the design to them herself at their kitchen tables, with the maps answering every question until they understood it completely. She had learned in the months since the council ruling that the best way to make a true thing durable was to make sure more than one person understood it. Truth that only one person carries is vulnerable. Truth that a whole community understands is a different order of thing. So she taught. She had not set out to teach. It had started simply Jonas asking a question about the tributary flow, Eleanor answering it more completely than he had expected, Jonas bringing one of the construction crew the following day who had the same question. Then Walt Greer came by one afternoon with a young man he was training in survey work and asked if Eleanor would look over some documentation with them, because her eye for notation was something he had not encountered in many years, and Eleanor said yes. And 3 hours later, she had explained her grandfather's methodology from the ground up, and the young man had taken 6 pages of notes. Word traveled the way. Word travels in small counties through the particular channel of people telling other people about something that surprised them. By the time the irrigation channel was completed, Eleanor had been informally consulted on water rights questions by 4 neighboring families, 2 of whom had land disputes entirely unrelated to Caldwell that had been sitting unresolved for years because they did not know how to read the relevant documentation. She did not charge for this. She did not think of it as a service. She thought of it as the use of knowledge that had always been intended to be used. William watched all of this with the expression she had come to know as his version of profound satisfaction. Quiet, private. The look of a man seeing something come true that he had believed was possible before he had evidence for it. "You know," he said one evening when she came in from a meeting with the Peters family about their eastern boundary survey, "I think you may have found what you were meant to do." Eleanor set down her notebook. "I've always known what I was meant to do," she said. "I simply didn't have room to do it." And now, she looked around the kitchen, at the tin box on the shelf, at the maps pinned to the wall beside the window, her own maps now alongside her grandfather's, at the notebook she carried everywhere, at the life that had assembled itself around the act of finally being who she was without apology. "Now I have room," she said. The first real test of that room came in the spring, 18 months after the council ruling. It came not from Caldwell, who had, as William predicted, reassessed and redirected his energies toward counties where the opposition was less organized and the documentation less thorough, but from an entirely different direction. A man named Forsyth arrived in Willow Creek in March, representing a land consortium out of Kansas City. He had the polished manner of a man who had made his living in rooms where the final decisions were made, and he came with papers and proposals, and the specific confidence of someone who has been successful enough that he has stopped expecting to encounter the unexpected. He requested a meeting with the Carter Ranch. William agreed because refusing to meet was rarely the right strategy, and because Eleanor had said, "Let him come. I want to hear what he's proposing before we respond to it." Forsyth sat across from them at the kitchen table. The same table, the same tin box on the shelf behind Eleanor's shoulder, and he laid out his proposal with professional efficiency. The consortium wanted to acquire water rights to the Valley Spring. Not the land, not the ranches, just the rights to the spring's output for commercial use in a new cattle operation they were establishing 30 miles east. They were prepared to pay well, very well by any standard Eleanor had encountered in land dealings. He named a figure. William looked at Eleanor. Forsyth looked at William because Forsyth was a man who had been doing this long enough to understand that the primary decision-maker in a room is not always the most obvious person in it, and he had adjusted his attention accordingly within the first 10 minutes of the meeting, which Eleanor noticed and filed away. "The spring doesn't belong exclusively to Carter land," Eleanor said. Forsyth looked at her. "The spring originates on Carter property," she said. "But the water table that feeds it underlies 4 neighboring properties as well. A commercial extraction arrangement would affect the water availability for all of them. We don't have the authority to agree to this on their behalf." "The legal water rights," Forsyth began, "were established specifically to protect the community use," Eleanor said. "The council ruling 18 months ago was explicit about that. The spring is the originating source for the valley water system that 6 families depend on for their operations. A commercial extraction at the volume your consortium would require would measurably reduce the flow to the downstream properties." She paused. "I've done the calculations." Forsyth was quiet for a moment. He was recalibrating. She could see it, the particular adjustment of a man who had walked into a room expecting one kind of conversation and was now in a different one. "I don't have those calculations," he said. "I know," she said. "Would you like to see them?" She put them on the table. He read them. He was in the kitchen for another 2 hours. He did not get his water rights agreement. What he did get eventually was a counterproposal that Eleanor had been working through in her mind since the morning his request for a meeting had arrived, a limited seasonal access arrangement volume, capped with revenue shared proportionally among all 6 families whose land was part of the affected water system, with an independent measurement mechanism to ensure the cap was honored. Forsyth took it back to Kansas City. He came back 3 weeks later and said the consortium would accept the terms. Eleanor wrote the agreement herself. She had Jonas ride to Wichita for the legal filing and had each of the 6 families sign as co-parties, not as secondary interests. William signed last, and he looked at her across the table as he signed it, and the look between them carried everything that did not need to be said out loud. The Willow Creek Water Compact, as it came to be called, was the first document of its kind in the county. Price cited it 2 years later when a similar situation arose in the northern township. The county engineer referenced it in a planning document in 1884. Eleanor did not know about either of these things for some time because she was not paying attention to what people said about her work. She was paying attention to the work. That was the year Amelia married. The wedding was in October. A quiet man named Daniel Foster, who farmed wheat and was the kind of person whose goodness was immediately evident without needing to be demonstrated dramatically. Amelia had chosen well, which Eleanor had suspected she would. When given enough time, Amelia's instincts about people were sounder than her upbringing had given her room to trust. The reception was at the Whitmore house, which meant Eleanor walked back through those rooms for the first time since her own wedding, and she stood for a moment in the kitchen doorway, where she had stood so many times, looking out at the parlor invisible and useful, and felt the strangeness of it. Charlotte found her there. "You're doing it again," Charlotte said. "Doing what?" "Standing in doorways," Charlotte said. "You used to do it to look out. Now you do it to look back." Eleanor turned to look at her sister. Charlotte was in her good blue dress, and her hair was done the way she did it for occasions, and she was 31 now, and the years had given her face something the beauty had not always had, a quality of knowing of having been through things. "How are you?" Eleanor said. Actually said not as a social performance. "Better," Charlotte said. And then, because Charlotte had been practicing honesty in small doses since the day she had stood up to Caldwell in her father's parlor, genuinely better, not performing better. "What happened?" Charlotte was quiet for a moment. "I stopped being what the front room required," she said. "It turns out the front room doesn't actually require anything. It's a room. I was the one placing requirements on it." She paused. "I have been talking to Mrs. Harmon, David Harmon's wife. She runs the women's reading group in town. I've been—" She stopped, started again. "I've been doing things, small things, but real ones." Eleanor looked at her sister. "I'm glad," she said. "Don't be too glad," Charlotte said. "I'm still better at performing than you are." "I know," Eleanor said. "Some skills should not be wasted." Charlotte laughed, a real one, unguarded and brief, and the kitchen felt different than it ever had when Eleanor had been the one standing in it alone. Their father found Eleanor in the garden before the reception ended. Harold Whitmore was slower than he had been. Not dramatically, not in the way of illness, but in the way of men. In their late 50s who have lived with some weight for a long time and carry it differently than they used to. He stood beside Eleanor and looked at the yard and did not say anything for a while, which was his language, and she had learned to wait inside his language rather than speaking over it. "The compact," he said finally. "The water compact. I read about it." "Jonas filed a copy with the county record," Eleanor said. "I know." He turned the brim of his hat in his hands. "It's a good piece of work. Careful." "Grandfather's notation," she said. "He taught me how to be careful with documentation." Harold was quiet. "I should have listened to you," he said. "Years ago. In this house. When you said things about the land and the water, and I told you to be quiet." He stopped. Started again. "I should have listened." Eleanor looked at her father. At this man who had put her in the kitchen and told himself it was the right arrangement, and had been the particular kind of wrong that comes not from cruelty, but from not looking. who had said that that's enough in a room where she was saying the true thing and had meant it in the worst possible way, and who was standing here now in his own garden on his youngest daughter's wedding day, telling her in the only language he had that he knew it. She had thought sometimes about what it would feel like when this moment came. She had imagined it arriving with more drama, more emotion maybe on both sides, a reckoning with clean edges. It didn't have clean edges. It was just a man in his late 50s turning his hat in his hands, and a woman in her late 20s looking at him, and both of them standing in the gap between what had been and what could still be built. "I know," she said. "That's all," he said. And there was something in it, not a challenge, more like he had expected something harder and was uncertain about the quietness of what he got. "What would you like me to say, Father?" He thought about it. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Neither do I," she said. "So let's start with I know and see what comes after." He nodded. They stood together in the garden until the sound of people coming out of the house reached them, and then they went back in, and Eleanor danced one slow dance with William that evening, and spent the rest of the reception sitting with Amelia and Charlotte, and talking about things that did not have to do with land or law or water rights, and it was the best evening she had spent in that house in 26 years, 3 years after the council ruling. Willow Creek held its annual county gathering, the thing they called a fair in the generous Western sense of the word, which meant livestock and food, and the various competitions that small communities use to remind themselves they are communities. Eleanor went with William and Jonas's wife Martha, who had become someone Eleanor talked to on Tuesday afternoons about everything and nothing, which was a form of friendship she had not had before and valued more than she had words for. A girl found her at the edge of the gathering. She was perhaps 12, with the watchful eyes of a child who pays attention to things that other people don't notice, and she was holding a notebook. She looked at Eleanor with the specific directness of someone who has been working up to something and has decided to stop waiting. "Are you Mrs. Carter?" the girl said. "I am," Eleanor said. "The one who found the surveys." "I had the surveys," Eleanor said. "My grandfather found the water." The girl considered this distinction carefully, which told Eleanor something important about her. "My father has a land dispute," she said, "about our eastern fence line. He says the survey is wrong, but nobody will listen to him." Eleanor looked at her. "What's your name?" "Clara," the girl said. "Clara Briggs. Not Jonas's daughter Wrong. Briggs, but a family." Eleanor recognized from the county records a farming family 3 miles south with good land and a long-standing boundary question that had been sitting unresolved for years. "Does your father have the original survey documentation?" Eleanor said. "No, he says it was lost." "Documentation is rarely lost," Eleanor said. "It's usually misfiled or unindexed. Do you know which county office handled the original filing?" The girl reached into her coat pocket and produced a piece of paper on which she had written in careful handwriting the name of the county office and the filing year and the parcel number. Eleanor stared at it. Then she looked at the girl. 12 years old, notebook in hand, paper in pocket with the relevant documentation prepared. Standing at the edge of a county gathering, working up the courage to approach a woman she had never met and ask for help with a land dispute. Eleanor felt something move through her chest that was so large and so specific that she had to look away for a moment. She was looking at herself. Not literally, not sentimentally, but in the absolute practical sense, she was looking at a girl who paid attention, who wrote things down, who had the right information and the wrong audience, and who was going to spend the next 20 years being invisible if nobody gave her room. "Clara," she said. "Ma'am. Come to the Carter Ranch on Thursday," Eleanor said. "Bring that paper and your notebook. I'll teach you how to read a survey." The girl stood very still. "Really?" she said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "You've already done the hardest part." "I have." "You wrote it down," Eleanor said. "Most people with important information never write it down. You did. That tells me you already understand what matters." She paused. "The rest is just learning the language." Clara looked at the paper in her hand, then at Eleanor. "Thursday," she said. "Thursday," Eleanor confirmed. Clara went back to wherever she had come from, and Eleanor stood where she was for a moment, and William found her there and looked at her face and said, "What just happened?" "I think," Eleanor said slowly, "I just found what comes next." Clara Briggs came on Thursday. She came back the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that. She had the kind of mind that absorbed notation systems, the way dry ground absorbs water, fast completely without resistance, and she asked questions with the precision of someone who wants to actually understand a thing, not just appear to understand it. By the second month, she could read a standard county survey without assistance. By the fourth month, Eleanor trusted her to identify indexing errors in the county record independently. She was not the only one. The girl brought her younger brother. The younger brother mentioned it to a boy at the schoolhouse. The boy's older sister came. It did not happen quickly or dramatically. It happened the way real things happen, one person at a time, each one arriving because someone they trusted had told them there was a place where they would be taught something real. Eleanor did not name it or organize it formally. She did not think of it as a school because that word carried the weight of institutions, and she was not running an institution. She was doing what her grandfather had done for her, teaching the language of land and water and documentation to people who paid attention, because those people existed in every generation, and they were always the ones who ended up standing in kitchens while the world arranged itself around them. And Eleanor had decided that was no longer going to go unaddressed if she had anything to say about it. She had quite a lot to say about it. The afternoon she found the old coffee cup was an ordinary Tuesday in autumn 4 years after her wedding. She was reorganizing the highest kitchen shelf, the one she rarely reached to make room for a set of documentation binders she had been accumulating, and she moved aside her grandmother's dishes and found the cup tucked behind them. Small white, chipped on the rim where it had been set down too hard one time, or dropped, or simply lived too long in a place where things were used until they wore out. She stood on the step stool and held it and looked at it. She remembered the weight of it in her hands that first day. The coffee pot, the parlor, the moment her mother had said she helps with the household, like she was furniture that happened to pour accurately. She remembered carrying it back and forth cup after cup, making sure everyone else had enough before she saw to herself. She remembered William watching her do it and recognizing something in it that she had not been able to see from the inside. She climbed down from the step stool. She did not put the cup back. She washed it carefully and set it on the shelf in plain sight next to the tin box where she would see it every morning when she came in before dawn to start the coffee. William came into the kitchen an hour later and stopped when he saw it. "Where did you find that?" he said. "Behind the good dishes," she said. He looked at it for a long moment. "You're keeping it there?" "Yes." He did not ask why, because he knew why. He knew her well enough now to read the shape of a decision without needing the explanation, which was one of the many things she had come to understand was what it felt like to be genuinely known by someone. "Good," he said simply. She poured 2 cups of coffee from the good pot, the one she had bought herself, the one that worked properly and did not need to be managed carefully to avoid burning, and set one in front of him, and kept one for herself. And they sat at the kitchen table together, which was how most mornings began now. He reached across and took her hand. She let him. Outside the Carter Ranch was waking up Jonas, calling to the crew, the specific sounds of a working property that was larger and more productive than it had been before she arrived, because the irrigation channel fed the south pasture properly now, and the cattle operation had expanded in the direction she had proposed, and the documentation systems she had put in place meant nothing fell through the cracks in the way things had before. The ranch worked because both of them worked at it, which was what she had told him she needed from the beginning, and what he had told her he wanted, and what they had built together out of that agreement. William looked at her across the table. "What are you thinking about?" he said. She thought about it honestly. "The girl at the county gathering," she said. "Clara. When she's 40, she'll be doing this better than I do." "Yes," he said. "That's the point," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why I said yes." She squeezed his hand once and let go and picked up her coffee and turned to the notebook on the table. The current one, the fourth in a series filled with survey annotations and water table calculations and the land dispute documentation she was working through with the Peters family, and 3 pages of notes from her last Thursday session with Clara and the others. She opened to a fresh page, wrote the date in the top right corner, the way her grandfather had taught her, because dates were how you proved a thing happened when you said it happened. She thought about all the things that had happened when she said they would. The spring, the compact, the council ruling, the channel, the Thursdays, this table, this man, this life that was hers, actually fully, undeniably hers, not because someone had given it to her, but because she had known what she knew and said what was true and refused finally and permanently to disappear. She had been invisible for 26 years, and she had spent the years since making herself legible not to the world in the abstract, but to the specific people in front of her, one at a time, in the honest and unglamorous way that real change actually happens. She was not finished. She did not expect to be finished. But she was here, and she was known, and the work was real, and the man across the table loved her the way that mattered, not because she was convenient or impressive or adequately beautiful, but because he had sat across from her at this table and seen who she was, and found it to be exactly, completely, unreservedly enough. Nobody had ever found her enough before. She had learned to be her own evidence that she was. Outside, the sun was fully up now. The ranch was in full motion. The south pasture irrigation ran clean from the eastern tributary the way she had calculated it would. The tin box sat on the shelf with her grandfather's surveys, and the council ruling, and the compact and everything that had been fought for and kept. The chipped cup sat beside it, plain and small and permanent. A reminder not of who she had been in the background, but of exactly how far a woman travels when the world finally stops being able to hold her there. Eleanor Whitmore Carter picked up her pen. She had work to do, and for the first time in her life, every room she walked into knew it.